For time's sake, we'll kick this thing off. I'm Phil Nash, on the marketing team for Output Sports, and I'm super excited to host Dr. James Malone again, which is our pleasure to have him on, bringing his expertise this time, talking about preseason performance and specifically how you can use output within your preseason prep program. Try saying that three times fast, but Dr. James Malone, I'll toss it over to you, let you introduce yourself, let you steal the show, and take it away. And excited to be taking notes on the side here.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Phil. Appreciate the introduction. And thanks for everyone for joining us this afternoon, morning, wherever you are in the world. I guess today is very topical in terms of the time of year for most, I guess. So maybe not everyone in the group, because I saw there's a few in America, but certainly in Europe, we're obviously in the midst of start of pre-season. So what I thought I'd do today is to just try and present some practical strategies that you can use specifically with the output system and some of the metrics you can look at to hopefully track your players and deliver them safely across the preseason period. Just to introduce myself, I do recognize some faces on the chat as well, so it's nice that we've got some people who've revisited the webinars. But for anyone who's new, my name's Dr. James Malone. I started my career back in 2009, so I first worked at Everton Football Club in the UK. I was a first team sports scientist as an intern, which was quite an interesting time, a good time to learn from some really top practitioners and players as well. Following that period, I went to the rival team, to Liverpool Football Club, and spent 3 seasons there as part of my PhD. So I was the first team sports scientist across those 3 years. And then following that period, I went into the commercial world. So I spent 3 years as the EMEA, as they call it, sports scientist for Catapult Sports. And then after that period, I decided to go into academia and then spent the last 8 or 9 years as a senior lecturer in Liverpool. And then most recently, the start of this year, I decided to go back to the real world and outside the classroom and has started my own business called Malone Performance. And my work now is very much in the football space, working with teams, individuals, practitioners to improve performance and careers as well. That's enough about me. In terms of today's session, these are the three key objectives I would say that we're going to try and get out of it. So first thing is to understand, like I said before, how to use output to integrate into your planning, into how to deliver an effective pre-season. Secondly, is looking at some of the scheduling of this, so how easy or how difficult it can be sometimes to schedule within your pre-season. And lastly, looking at some case studies on how we can apply the data to hopefully make some positive changes and outcomes. So firstly, pre-season, it's obviously a crucial time of year. It's something that I think is becoming more difficult as the years go on. So this year in particular, we've had the introduction of the FIFA Club World Cup, which is still going on. So we still have another week or so of the competition till the final. I think the end date's about 14th of July. So, we've got many domestic seasons in Europe starting sort of mid-August. So it pretty much leaves 4 weeks for those teams who finished into the final and then the start of the next season. So the days of a full pre-season for most is becoming very limited. Even off seasons are becoming very difficult now. But as we can see here from Jan Ekstrand's group, from the UEFA study group, essentially the more of pre-season that we can complete safely in terms of delivery in a structured way, the lower our injury burden and frequency during the season. So roughly speaking, about every 10 sessions pre-season completed results in a 22 layoff day reduction across 1,000 hours. So for some teams, you might have a full 6 to 8 weeks if you're lucky. Other teams, you might have a shorter period. You might have it broken into different parts. You may have a main preseason now. Maybe you've got a Christmas break and then a mini preseason. So there's different elements and timeframes that we can work towards. But the idea of any preseason is to improve fitness, but also integrate the technical and tactical aspects as well. And I think over the years, these are some of the challenges that I've seen and heard from practitioners when it comes to pre-season planning. The first I've already mentioned in detail, which is the time constraints that we're faced with, unfortunately. The second is the variance of fitness as well. So I think the days of crazy off seasons for players and completely losing fitness is pretty much out the window now. However, you still got some variance in professionalism and people who adhere to the off-season program better than others. But the same being said, if they've maybe had a international competition, we've got the World Cup coming up next year, things like that, versus players who don't play in the World Cup, who just train at home. These are the sort of things that can cause variance in the fitness levels. You may have also have some players returning from injury, so players who have either undergone long-term rehabs and maybe just missed out returning before the end of the previous season. So then you've had the off season and pre-season to again rebuild and integrate back into the team. And lastly is how we monitor things, which hopefully we'll get across today. But we're in a world of data with AI and all of these different things, and it can become very difficult actually for practitioners to understand the metrics that matter and the data that we can use to make a practical difference. So with output, if you're a customer already or if you're thinking about it, probably the biggest thing for me with the system is the usability of it, because I think years gone by, 15 years ago when I first started in football, a testing day was a big thing. Your first day back, your second day back, you'd have all of these tests that you have to administer. And players used to hate it mostly because it was a big burden. Coaches hated it because it got in the way of training and the things that they wanted to do. And I think this is where we've seen a shift now in terms of things like invisible monitoring, as it's called, and using technology such as output, where we can derive really quick, objective data using portable systems at a group and individual level. So for me, this is where output comes in super handy in pre-season, is being able to get these insights, repeatedly and be able to make action points off the back of it as well. Now, on the output system, there's a heap of different tests. You can go on the company's website and you can see all of the different variants. But for me, the three big pillars or three big areas that we can use it is in the areas of strength, in power, and mobility. So these three things obviously are super important for any level of footballer, and it's things that we can easily track and use the software as well to make sure that we keep on track of things there. When it comes to strength, because of the way the device works, where you can literally strap it onto a barbell or a machine-based exercise as well, we can track our different metrics such as range of motion, angular velocity, and power outputs, etc., and things like this. So obviously in pre-season, the first initial phase, there'll be a lot of foundational strength work being done. Again, it depends on the adherence to the off-season program. But essentially, if we can lay the foundation in the first week or two, then by week 3 to 4, we'll start to intensify what we do. So the loads and the intensity of the lifts will generally go up. And then obviously in the last phase, we want to try and taper down. So with this, if we can maybe track some of the key lifts, it doesn't have to be every single lift that the players do. But to give some examples, you may track some compound lift. Maybe your players do lifts like an overhead press, or for example, double leg squats. Or you can even look at single leg variants. So whether it's a unilateral movement, whether it's a Bulgarian or a single leg squat, something like this, or even a machine-based exercise, for example, leg press, or if people use it in combination with other systems such as Kaiser, who do a lot of the good air resistance type work as well. So these are the sorts of things where we can collect that data over time. Obviously, power is super important for any footballer. Big part of this is the different types of movements that we want to try and conduct. And again, this is where output can be really cool because, as you can see with the example exercises and movements there, these are things very specific to the sport. So counter movement jump, tons of research around its link to performance and fatigue and etc. So if we can measure that without the need for force plate setup, calibration, even some of the older school techniques like the jump mats and going even older school where you jump up and mark on the wall. If you're able to just attach it to the foot, like you can see here, it's an easy way to collect that jump height and that sort of data that you need. In addition, you can use it for things like, med ball slams, any sort of throwing, horizontal movements, VBT, which I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but again, that's becoming super popular as well across different football and gyms. And on the other side as well is looking at fatigue. So again, counter movement jump or things like RSI, reactive strength index, can be really useful. And it's something that I went through on the previous webinar, which is available on the Output website. And then the other pillar, which is something that maybe we overlook slightly, is our mobility. So how we can test and look at this as well. So often, this is maybe led by the physio team, the medical team. Maybe you do some, movement screening, whether it's FMS or something of a similar notion. We can use Output again, as you can see from the image, by attaching it to the various limbs. We can do some basic testing on the medical bed, in the gym, and look at some potential limitations in range of movement, or maybe some asymmetries between the left and right side of the body. Some examples of this, so obviously with the hip, we want to make sure we have some nice mobile hips for players, ankle stiffness and flexibility, and of course our hamstring flexibility as well. So to kind of give this an overview, so let's say this is a really good scenario where you've maybe got a good 6-week period to monitor and to implement your training. As I say, most teams now it's getting shorter. Some team might be even a little bit longer if you're lucky. But essentially, in that first week, you'll need to conduct your baseline. So if you've been an Output user for a while, you're obviously going to have historical data as well to track and to compare your data with. But if you, for example, just bought the system, you can use that for baseline testing in week 1. By weeks 2 or 3, this is, like I say, where we transition to our higher weeks, maybe by week 3 or 4. So when the load starts to increase, we obviously want to check that firstly we're on track. So these monitoring weeks, as it's called here, is to ensure that things are hopefully progressing, strength and flexibility power is trending in a good way. But obviously, if you've brought in too much fatigue or too much load too early, that might actually hinder the adaptation in those early weeks. And then when we get to week 5 in this example, this would be probably our main reassessment week, because by week 6, obviously we're tapering down. Week 6, we want to keep it really fresh, so we'll probably avoid too much testing in that week in particular. Maybe some slight testing we could do, but the majority of the testing we could do the week before in week 5, and that way it gives us a nice comparison versus our baseline data. And I think, the good thing with the Output system is that you can easily track this. You can put it into the software, so there's no need for, separate Excel sheets or Power BI templates and things like this. You can track it all in the one platform. So that early stage, as I say, you want to try and create your baseline measures. An important thing is obviously to understand variability as well. So something again I mentioned in the previous webinar is understanding things like the coefficient of variation and the error around your test. So one thing I'd always recommend for people to do with data is to do your own in-house testing. Try and get maybe a handful of players or even yourselves in off season to just establish what's the error, what's the the noise around the signal. And then obviously you can use this baseline, as I said in the previous slide, to then compare your future results against. And the one thing I'd say is choose a testing battery that is useful for you. So in this example, you can see here, we've got some counter movement jump, some RSI. So both of those will give us both performance data, but also be useful for fatigue. Get my words out, fatigue data. Mobility, we've already mentioned, but then even things like, pogos, which are really common now within plyometric type work, or even some horizontal bounds as well. So these things which aren't, strictly or traditionally a test that we'd use, but if they're exercises that you're administering on a weekly basis, it makes sense to track what those exercises are doing as well. As I mentioned, when we get to this monitoring phase of, roughly weeks 2 to 3 in pre-season, this is where we can start to, dip our our toe in the water just to see, are we on track with things? Do we need to maybe reassess the program? So in this case, we might have some non-responders, so people who are either, the load's not enough, so they're not responding, or it's too high maybe, so then you've got that overload risk as well. So it's the Goldilocks principle, trying to find that sweet spot of too much and too little. And again, output sports can just help to assess trends in fatigue, track adaptation, as I said before, with the specific exercises that you follow to ensure that everything is hopefully going in the right direction. And that final phase, that adaptation phase, when we can use our final data to hopefully see that, things are being on track. By doing it in weeks 4 to 5, let's say you've then got week 6 as a full tapering week, it still allows time to then adapt things. So let's say you get to week 4 to 5 and, a player is exhibiting some really high fatigue and really, not adapting in the best way. That would mean then for week 6, we can inform that training program. We can really taper down. Maybe we have to individualize it away from the team to ensure that we're not overloaded in week 6, because the last thing we want to do by week 7, which is the first week in season, is to carry that fatigue into the first game. So here's a sample sort of weekly overview of how we can maybe test. And this is just an example. Again, it depends on your own schedule and how things look for you. But one advice and one thing I would say is trying to match up the testing that you do for the theme of the day, whether that's the theme of the gym or whether it's an on-pitch theme as well. So in this example, we've got a friendly match on the Saturday where, let's say, you might have players doing 45 minutes each, or as the minutes progress, that might go to 60, 70 minutes for some players. Before that, we've got a fairly standard training week in pre-season. So let's say you might have the Monday and the Friday as almost bookends of this. So you've got some mobility testing to firstly test on the Monday to see, where the players are at. The Friday's a good one, match day -1. So you can see the impact of the week's training going into the match day as well. So they might be two useful optional markers there. And then through the week, we might drop in, let's say we do our main lift on the Tuesday. So maybe on the match day -4, we can then drop in our strength testing. And then let's say we do most of our work in terms of power on either a Wednesday or it could be a Thursday, depending on the schedule. We can then drop in our, jump testing, our bounds, pogos, these sorts of things that we could also administer as well. So as I say, depends on your schedule, depends on the match as well. Obviously, results in the pre-season friendly isn't as important. So if they carry some fatigue and it's not the end of the world, but where we can, we try and structure it around the microcycle and link to the day's theme. So within the software, we can hopefully then integrate the outcomes into the planning process. Now, it's not to say if there's a flag in output software that you go to the head coach and you drastically change everything, because as we all know, that's not how the game works. But obviously these sort of things, these red flags, are just conversation starters. So these are the things that we can hopefully talk about the medical meetings, sports science meetings, and then if it needs to be brought up to the coaches as well, that's when we can maybe look to adjust. So particularly the gym, which is something that we do tend to have more control over, we can monitor those adaptations. If a player is struggling for strength adaptation, maybe we can add in some additional eccentric work for particular exercises. If players are struggling with recovery, we can also then flag those for maybe reduction of load in the gym, or even then obviously on the grass as well when we speak to the coaches. And then lastly, all around tapering. So I think this is a common mistake some people make, is to just go a bit too hard in weeks 5 and 6, which is counterintuitive to what periodization is all about. Those final week or so, you need to start to drop that load. So all of these things, like I say, it's just a tool. It's just a conversation starter, but hopefully it will lead to some positive discussions with the coaches and your fellow staff. So I'm just going to talk briefly about again how we can implement some of this into the real world, some of the case study approach. So with this one, let's say in this example here, we have some initial testing. So we do this one in week 0. So, well, week 1, I should say. We see here that we have some asymmetry. So let's say if we do some single leg counter movement jump type work, we see that there's obviously a discrepancy between left and right. So that's obviously a red flag. Secondly, you might see for this player that they're struggling, particularly with the hamstring strength. So maybe the eccentric strength is down compared to what they're used to. And lastly, there's a mobility issue as well, where we have some limited rotation, particularly on the dominant side with their hip. So these sorts of things, to have all three at once can be a bit of a nightmare because there's different things you have to unpack. But sometimes these things can also be linked together as well that cause the issues. So then what do we do? How do we change it up? How do we implement things? Well, firstly, if we want to fix the eccentric strength issue, maybe we bring in some specific work. So depending on your athlete, your player, it depends what exercises they prefer or adapt well to. So I've put here, Romanian deadlifts would be a good one. People would say Nordics as well, but obviously then there's people who don't like Nordics and players who don't like Nordics as well, the feel of them, and it's a bit of a tricky exercise to perform if you're not used to it. So for me, Romanians are a really good one because you can load it pretty well. There is some risk of the lower back, some issues there, but generally, if you start fairly light and build up, it's a pretty safe exercise. Maybe then with some interventions in the program, you look to include some more mobility drills for the hip. So example would be 90-90 hip switch, just trying to open those hips up and increase that mobility. And lastly, maybe because of some of the issues, so oops, let me just go back a second. So because of maybe some of these asymmetries as well, maybe we could target some single leg work, maybe we can adjust as well. So rather than doing purely bilateral work, we can do more unilateral work. So we can hopefully close that gap between the asymmetry of different sides. And then what we can do is obviously then track the output system. We can track and see, what is it we're hopefully looking to get from it. So firstly, it would be the counter movement jump. So again, we'd retest possibly in weeks 2 and 3, just to see how the trend is looking. And then obviously by week 5, we're hopefully seeing that gap or those issues close down. In this example, if you're able to bring in that specific unilateral work, hopefully then we can reduce asymmetry by, in this example, 80%. That would be great. Secondly, by adjusting the eccentric work that they're doing, we can increase those strength scores measured through the output system. And the most important thing here is then availability. As I mentioned all the way back to the first slide, so the Jan Ekstrand study, availability is so important. It's the same in season, obviously, as well, but particularly in pre-season, if a player can undertake a full pre-season, I've seen it firsthand. It just makes such a big difference in season for injury risk, for performance. It really does lay the foundations for everything that follows. So if you can get a player above 95% availability of training and matches, you're doing a very good job. In this example, that's what they were able to achieve. You know, that would be great. Sometimes it can vary. If a player gets a contact injury and injuries happen, then there's not much you can do. But the last thing you want is in those early weeks is to have any soft tissue issues. And, again, by closing these gaps, by increasing strength scores, we can hopefully limit those injury risks and improve availability. So lastly, just some tips really in terms of things that you can take away, hopefully, and some of the, I guess, implementations. And I think sometimes people get these pieces of kit like output and get a little bit excited and don't quite know how to use it. So the first thing for me is education. So the players understand what it is, what you're trying to do, what the data is showing. So using metrics that they understand, that you understand, and then hopefully we get that buy-in process. but it might take a bit of time. So the more you use it, the more they see it, the use of the data. But particularly in that gym environment, as we know, with output, you can set leaderboards for, various lifts. You can give them that real-time feedback as well. So things like that can really help with the buying process. The second thing is obviously then to train staff. So having, it's no good the sports scientist in the club knowing what they're doing, but then, the S&C coach doesn't understand it, the medical staff don't understand it. So again, have some standardization of protocols, show people how it's used, and then show the interventions and how we can use it in real world is going to help our MDTs and our process. The third thing I've mentioned before is trying to integrate it within the existing sessions. So, to do a few counter movement jumps in a warm up or as part of pre-activation sessions is not too difficult. So again, with output, it's just a case of strap it onto the shoe or the boot, and then off you go. Collect your data through the iPad or your phone, whichever method you want to use. It becomes a burden when obviously then it's a separate thing when you make a big testing day and a big theme of it. That's when coaches start to get the hump. So the more we can integrate, the better. The fourth point is to review things. So one of my bugbears is when people collect data for the sake of it. So if we can review, share the trends as part of those MDT discussions with coaches, speak to players as and when needed as well. Sometimes if we overshare, it can actually overburden players. So, obviously share results and findings, but don't try and overcomplicate the situation. And lastly, keep the workflow simple and, as it mentions here, repeatable. So I think this is, and this is a wider point, not just to do with output, but we often test in pre-season without any real follow-up. So, I know practitioners who do lab-based testing, so they'll go in and do a VO2 or a lactate threshold test in week one, which is great. But then due to practicality, they're not able to follow it up either the rest of pre-season or even in season. So they have this really cool, nice physiological data point at the start, but then nothing else to then show that what you're doing in training and matches is actually working. So this is the great thing with output is that it keeps everything simple. It's transferable to different things, but most importantly, it's repeatable for long-term use. So across pre-season, into the in-season, and then even if you want to as well, you could implement in the off-season to keep that calendar view of the progression. And then some final thoughts. So key thing with anything is to build individual baselines. There's, if you go into the Output website and the blogs, you can see there's tables of normative data, which can be really useful for a lot of these tests. But again, try and build your individual player baselines to see where they're at with things. Monitor weekly. So I've showed you there an example in the microcycle how you can easily implement these tests across the week and do so with consistency. And then lastly, hopefully with this information, this data, you can adjust your gym load or on pitch if needed with some elements of confidence rather than, if you just use GPS alone, that's just one marker of external load. It's not telling you how people are responding to different stimuli. Okay, and that's it. So bit short and sweet today, 30 minutes. Hopefully it gives a little bit more time for questions as well. But yeah, hopefully it's given you some thoughts. And if anyone would like to connect with me, you can see all of my details, social media things, websites, etc. But there we go. All right, Phil, over to you, mate.
Yeah, no, James, this is perfect. And I'll throw your football scientist newsletter link in the chat here if y'all it comes out on Fridays, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, mate, 12 UK time. So what's that? 1 p.m. Central European and
Hmm.
something in America. Who
Something
knows?
in America, sometime around 8 a.m., 7 a.m. in America. But it'll be in your inbox. It's not going to go anywhere. But no, it's if you like this webinar, if you've liked some of the stuff that Dr. Malone's put out for Output recently, a lot of great stuff in your inbox weekly with that newsletter as well. I subscribe. I love reading it every Friday. But with that said, Any questions that we have? I know I have a couple. Please throw them in the chat. So any questions, throw them in the chat, and we'll take a couple minutes here to work through them. And while we give people a minute to throw in their question, for me, one thing that's been top of mind anytime we talk about preseason testing, you mentioned some of the variability as far as like the fitness level that athletes come in with and how that's changed for the better over the years. At least from my experience in American sport as well, athletes generally are coming in to the season way better condition, in better shape, having touchdown speed and power and all these important qualities. But from a testing standpoint, how do you kind of filter through the noise and understand as the preseason goes on? The athletes, like the quality that you're training, whether it's like lower body power or speed, is getting better, and the athlete's not just getting better at the test.
Yeah, I think with any test that you do, not just with output, there is a learning effect.
Mhm.
So as I mentioned before, if you're a habitual user of the system, then if you've used it for maybe a season or two, you'd have hopefully removed that learning effect. If again your protocols and everything is repeatable. That being said, you are right, Phil. If you're brand new to this, and you've never used it before, then there is going to be some learning effect. But then some of the tests I mentioned there, so for example, counter movement jump,
Yeah.
is a fundamental of pretty much anyone. So it doesn't matter if you've used a different system or whatever to measure that, the movement itself is nothing new. It's when, to give an example, if you were to use Nordic testing, which I know some
Mhm.
people do, and you can use output for that. If they're not used to Nordics, then there is going to be that learning effect, which might take, 3, 4, 5 testing sessions to remove firstly before you start to get that stabilization.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 100%. It's a great point with the counter movement jump example, especially with the increase in testing and monitoring counter movement jump being a staple. That's a great point there as far as like the simplicity of the movement goes compared to a Nordic. We have a question from Harris. How do you recommend using VBT in a team setting with minimal bar availability?
Yeah, good question. I think mainly to do with just keeping your zone simple. So I think some of the things with VBT is to try and just understand individually what people are doing. So I think if you can keep the zones themselves quite simple, so if you're doing more of a strength session, maybe keep it to like 0.3, 0.5 meters per second, maybe power, 0.7 to 1, maybe something like that. And then if it's more like speed ballistic type work, probably above 1 meters per second as well. So keeping those zones pretty simple, I would say, is firstly a good approach, and then obviously if you can load different ways. I mean, if you can, I'm not sure how many squat racks you've got in this example, but you can easily try and cycle. The great thing with this is the system is instant. The data you get from it, so you can, even in a group setting, is just cycle through different people. So maybe you can have different loads on different squat racks, different bars, and then just try and cycle the players in that way in a rotational fashion.
Mm, yeah. Yeah. No, 100% kind of getting creative with how you use the barbells that you do have or use the squat racks that you do have. And for myself personally, using output, there's definitely some great usability for dumbbell movements, whether it's, putting the sensor on a kettlebell for a goblet squat or putting the sensor on a wrist for a dumbbell bench press or a dumbbell row. And you can perform a low velocity profile in any movement and kind of find your zones for, what would be strength and what would be power and what would be speed. But yeah, I think I love the idea of just, let's just simplistic zones of, if it's below, zero point 0.5 meters per second, it's probably strength, and using that, progressing that over time, progressively using heavier weights or getting progressively using heavier weights and letting the speeds get slower if the goal is strength and, using that as the guide. And like you said, with the feedback, anytime you get real-time feedback, it's going to drive intent, it's going to improve training quality. So that in and of itself is is a benefit for sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions, thoughts, comments, concerns? If not, I had one more. You mentioned normative data, and I'm always picking people's brains on this. How do you personally recommend using normative data?
Um, yeah, I mean, they can be useful. I mean, I mentioned before that individualization is key, especially at baseline level, but I think it's useful just to get a rough estimate of where players should be at. So this applies for any test that we do, and it's one question I get asked a lot is what's the normative value for speed testing? What is it for jump testing in different age groups, different populations, and there is published literature out there which can give you some of that, and then there's some non-peer review things that you can look up online as well that gives you some information. So this is where output's really good actually, is where you've got some tables I think on the blog pages and things like
Mhm.
that where you can easily go in and look and see for different levels, different standards where your players should be at. But yeah, I think the target should be within that team. So if you're let's give an example. If you've got a youth player who's trying to break through into the first team, and then you've got
Mhm.
your senior guy who's a super, top professional, then he or she is your benchmark, and
Yeah.
that youth player should be trying to at least aim or match that person. So
Yeah.
that's within the club. But then if you think more broadly and you say, right, this value X is what we'd expect from an elite player of this particular test, it still gives you something to drive and aim for. But
Mhm.
then, depending on the context, the level, then it's going to vary quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's good. And as you're answering that, a bunch of normative data questions rolled in um, from Richard. Do you have any up-to-date recommended websites for fitness testing?
Um, there probably isn't really. There used to be, I forget the name of it. There's an old classic one. Even I used as a student back in the day. I think it's called Brain Mac or something like that. People used to use it for their courseworks and everything,
Mhm.
plagiarized it. Um, but there isn't, I guess there isn't really like a central database where you can easily just log in. As I said before, like there's peer review papers. So if you go into Google Scholar and you check out, certain papers will have normative data for different age groups. Some websites, particularly the commercial companies now, I think are the ones driving this.
Yeah.
So the likes of Output, like I say, able to collate, large databases across different levels, different teams, and they're probably the best bet in terms of looking up, normative data for whatever test or system that you use. But yeah, maybe a gap in the market for someone to create a central database in football, in soccer for everything, and just have it in one place would be nice.
Yeah, there you go. That's the next venture right there. This is a good, not a bad idea.
I'll add it to my list of many
Add
things.
it
Yeah,
to the
so
list.
someone's put the Harris top end sports. I think that was the one I was trying to refer to. Actually, yeah, I used that as a student as well.
There's and just to wrap it up time wise, there's a couple output questions in there. If I can now, I lost them. I can find them. Daniel asking about recommended numbers or ranges for slams and throws. That's something that doesn't quite exist yet. Like trying to find or trying to build a bigger bank of data and better understand the limb velocities and how they relate to different strength qualities. But with that said, similar to what Dr. Malone just said, you can take your top athlete, who's throwing a certain load the fastest and use that as your standard and try to progress to that. Or, say you're doing a rotational throw with a 10-pound or 8-pound med ball, whatever it is, you can just progress the velocity that you're throwing that load over time as your athletes get faster. You're looking for that specific adaptation. And then a question on how well does output correct for the horizontal movement in Olympic lifts? Pretty well. Just like any other movement, especially barbell related movements, jumping related movements, There is a back end corrective equation for jump height for the Olympic lifts that keeps the horizontal movement, the noise out of the equation and keeps the numbers where they're supposed to be. So that is that. Sweet. All right. If there's no other questions, I think that's everything. And again, Dr. Malone, thank you. This has been great. I got a lot of great notes, a lot of great practical insight. I think it's gonna be one that people watch back for sure.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Phil. Thanks for the invite. And as I say, if anyone's got any other questions after this, feel free to reach out to me and connect on the different social media channels as well.
Sweet. All right. Well, thank you again, and everyone have a great rest of your day.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.